People talked about Evan and Marisol, not loudly, not cruelly, just enough to notice. At the grocery store, someone once whispered, "They're such a perfect couple." At church, a woman leaned over and said, "I wish my marriage looked like theirs." Even their neighbors noticed how calm their house was. No yelling, no drama, no doors slamming shut, just smiles, just routines, just quiet. But what no one saw, what no one ever gossiped about, was how lonely that quiet had become. Because behind closed doors, Evan and Marisol were sitting across from each other at the same kitchen table every night, sharing the same meals, living the same life, and saying nothing. Have you ever seen a couple that looked happy, but something felt off? Have you ever been in a relationship where everything was fine on the surface, but deep down you felt unseen, unheard, alone? This isn't a story about cheating. It isn't about betrayal or explosive arguments. It's about something far more common, and far more dangerous. It's about what happens when silence feels safer than honesty. Welcome back to Love Stories by Mr. Johnson, and to all our new listeners. This channel tells emotionally powerful love stories that reflect real life and real lessons. If you believe love stories should mean something, go ahead and subscribe now, because this one might sound quiet, but it will stay with you. Tonight's story is about a marriage everyone admired, and the loneliness that lived right between two people who loved each other deeply, but didn't know how to speak. Stay with me, because the moment that finally breaks their silence isn't loud at all. It's just a pause. The kettle had been screaming for nearly a full minute before either of them noticed. It wasn't that they couldn't hear it. The sound filled the small kitchen, sharp and insistent, bouncing off the cabinets and the pale walls like a warning that refused to soften. It was that neither of them moved. Not at first. Not right away. Evan sat at the narrow table with his hands folded, elbows resting where the wood had faded from years of use. His thumbs rubbed the same worn patch on his wedding ring, over and over, a motion so familiar it no longer required thought. He stared at the surface of the table, at a shallow scratch shaped like a question mark, though he had no memory of how it got there. Across from him, Marisol watched the kettle instead. Steam curled upward in slow, ghost-like ribbons, disappearing into the air before it reached the ceiling. She followed each wisp until it vanished, then waited for the next, as if they were saying something she was meant to understand. When the kettle finally clicked off by itself, the silence that rushed in felt heavier than the noise had been. Evan cleared his throat. Not to speak, just to remind himself that he could. Marisol reached for the mug beside her, then stopped. The teabag tag dangled over the rim, untouched. She folded it carefully, pressing it against the porcelain, a small act of order in a room that already looked perfectly arranged. They had mastered this kind of quiet. To anyone else, it would have looked peaceful, intimate even. A married couple sharing the end of a long day. Unhurried, comfortable enough not to fill the air with unnecessary words. The kind of quiet people envied when their own homes felt too loud, too chaotic, too full of unfinished arguments. But this silence had edges. It pressed in on them. Familiar and unchallenged, the way a room slowly darkens when no one bothers to turn on the light. Evan finally stood and turned off the stove, even though the kettle no longer needed it. The movement felt like something he was supposed to do. He poured the water, careful not to splash, then set Marisol's mug in front of her, handle angled just the way she liked. "Thanks," she said. Her voice was gentle. It always was. He nodded, sat back down, and wrapped both hands around his own mug. The heat seeped into his palms, grounding him. For a moment he considered saying something. Anything. About work, about the neighbor's new fence, about how cold it had been that morning. The moment passed. They drank in silence, the clock above the sink ticking louder than it should have. If someone had been watching from the window, they would have seen a couple at ease with each other. No tension in their shoulders. No sharp glances. No sighs heavy enough to suggest trouble. Evan's posture was relaxed, Marisol's expression calm. They were very good at this. At the grocery store earlier that evening, the cashier had smiled at them and said, "You two make it look easy." Marisol had smiled back automatically. Evan had reached for the bags before she could, the same way he always did. They moved through aisles like a practiced dance. She remembered the list, he remembered the coupons. She chose produce, he checked expiration dates. When she paused in front of a display of cereal, he grabbed the box she liked without asking. It looked like love because in many ways, it was. On the walk home, a neighbor waved and called out, "Evening, lovebirds." Evan squeezed Marisol's hand. She leaned into his side. Neither of them questioned it. Now, sitting across from each other again, that same ease settled in. Or maybe it had never left. Marisol set her mug down first. "I'm going to rinse this," she said, though it wasn't empty. "I can do it," Evan replied too quickly. She paused, then smiled. "It's okay, I've got it." Their fingers brushed as she stood, a light familiar contact that once would have sparked something warm and urgent. Now it felt like punctuation, soft, expected, unexamined. As she moved to the sink, Evan watched her without meaning to. The way she tucked her hair behind her ear. The way she leaned slightly forward, as if the world asked just a little more of her than it should have. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. He told himself there would be time later. Marisol rinsed the mug, dried it, and placed it carefully in the cabinet. She lingered there for a second, hands still on the shelf, listening. Evan was quiet behind her. Not the restless kind of quiet, the steady kind. She wondered, not for the first time, what he was thinking. The thought came with no urgency. Just a passing curiosity, like noticing a door you'd walked past 100 times without opening. She turned back to him. "You working late tomorrow?" He hesitated, just a fraction. "Probably." She nodded. "Okay." That was it. No disappointment voiced. No reassurance offered. The answer settled between them, accepted without inspection. This was how things stayed smooth. Later, when they sat on opposite ends of the couch, the television murmuring low, Marisol read while Evan scrolled through his phone. Their legs touched at the knee, a quiet reminder that they were still connected. Every so often, Evan glanced up, not at the screen, but at her. At the concentration in her brow. At the way she exhaled slowly, as if releasing something she hadn't named. He wanted to ask her how she was doing. He wanted to ask if she was happy. The questions felt too large, too risky. He swallowed them the way he always did, convincing himself that if something were wrong, she would say so. Marisol turned a page and felt the familiar tug of something unspoken. She sensed Evan's presence the way you sense weather through a closed window. Close. Indirect. Unavoidable. She thought about telling him she'd felt tired lately, not physically, but in a way she didn't quite have words for. She thought about mentioning the ache that crept in during quiet afternoons, the strange feeling of being useful but unseen. The words stayed where they were. She told herself this was normal. This was marriage. This was comfort. The clock ticked on. Neither of them noticed how much space silence was beginning to take up. Morning arrived without announcement. Sunlight slipped through the thin gap in the curtains, laying a pale stripe across the bedroom wall. Evan woke before the alarm, as he usually did. His body had learned the rhythm of responsibility long before his mind caught up. He lay still for a moment, listening. Marisol's breathing was soft and even beside him. One arm rested across the empty space between them, her hand curled loosely against the sheet, not quite touching him. It struck him, not for the first time, how often they slept like this, close enough to reach, far enough not to disturb. He watched the slow rise and fall of her chest, then quietly swung his legs over the side of the bed. He moved with care, the way you do when you don't want to wake someone, not because you're afraid of them being angry, but because you don't want to explain why you're already leaving. In the bathroom, Evan stared at his reflection while the water warmed. His face looked calm, steady, the kind of face people trusted. He splashed water on his cheeks, noticing the faint line between his eyebrows that hadn't always been there. As a boy, he had learned to read faces before voices. His father's temper announced itself in clenched jaws and narrowed eyes long before words followed. Evan had learned to grow quiet, to disappear into himself, to make his presence small enough not to attract attention. Silence had kept him safe then. It still felt like safety now. In the kitchen, Marisol moved through her morning routine with practiced ease. Coffee brewed. Toast popped. She stood at the counter scrolling through her phone, not really reading anything. Her mind lingered instead on the quiet heaviness she'd felt lately, like carrying a bag she couldn't set down. When Evan came in, she smiled. He smiled back. They shared the same morning they had shared 100 times before. "You're up early," she said. "Couldn't sleep," he replied. She didn't ask why. He didn't elaborate. They ate together in silence broken only by the radio playing softly in the background. A song came on that Marisol used to love, one she'd painted to once, years ago. She recognized it immediately. Evan did too. Neither of them said anything. After Evan left for work, Marisol lingered at the table, her coffee gone cold. The house felt too quiet in the daylight. Without the television or the low hum of evening routines, the silence stood out, sharp and exposed. She wandered into the spare room, the one they both pretended was still temporary. It held old boxes, a treadmill no one used, and a narrow desk by the window. She ran her fingers along the edge of it, stopping at a faint stain of blue paint that hadn't quite come out. She used to paint here. Every night, sometimes for hours. It had been the one place where she didn't feel the need to explain herself. Color spoke when words failed. She hadn't realized when she stopped. It wasn't a decision. There hadn't been a final painting or a moment of goodbye. One night she'd felt tired. Another night, distracted. Then the brushes dried out. The canvases gathered dust. The silence crept in where expression used to live. At work, Evan moved through meetings and deadlines with the same controlled efficiency he brought home. His co-workers respected him. Some admired him. They described him as dependable, easy to work with, calm under pressure. They didn't see the way his chest tightened whenever conflict hovered near. They didn't hear the thoughts he swallowed before speaking. At lunch, a colleague complained loudly about his wife, about her nagging, about how she never seemed satisfied. Evan smiled politely, nodded in the right places. Inside, something twisted. He told himself he was lucky. Marisol spent her afternoon running errands. At the pharmacy, an older woman ahead of her sighed and said, "Marriage is work, dear." Marisol nodded automatically, though the words landed heavier than expected. Was this what work felt like? That evening, they found themselves back in the kitchen again, standing on opposite sides of the island. Evan chopped vegetables. Marisol stirred a pot. They moved around each other without colliding, a choreography perfected over years. "You remember Sarah from next door?" Marisol asked. Evan glanced up. "Yeah. She's pregnant," Marisol said. "Oh," he replied. "That's nice." She waited, not sure for what. A question. A reaction. When none came, she nodded. "Yeah." Dinner passed quietly. They washed dishes together, Evan drying while Marisol washed, their shoulders occasionally brushing. The touch was warm, familiar, oddly distant. Later on the couch, Evan noticed Marisol staring at the television without really watching it. Her book lay untouched beside her. "You okay?" he asked. She turned toward him, surprised. The question hung there, simple and direct. "I'm fine," she said. He nodded, relieved. The answer closed the door neatly, saving him from stepping into something he wasn't sure how to navigate. But as the night wore on, the quiet grew heavier. Marisol felt it settle into her chest, pressing down gently, but persistently. She wondered how long she'd been answering that question the same way. How many times she'd said she was fine when what she meant was something else entirely. In bed, they lay facing opposite directions. Evan stared at the ceiling, listening to Marisol's breathing slow. He thought about asking her more, about telling her he felt distant lately, even from himself. The words felt clumsy in his mouth before he ever spoke them. He turned onto his side, reaching out until his hand rested lightly against her back. She shifted slightly, leaning into the touch without waking. The gesture comforted him. It always did. But comfort, he was beginning to realize, wasn't the same as closeness. As the room fell silent again, neither of them noticed the same thought passing through their minds, unspoken and unshared. Something is missing. And neither of them knew how to say it first. If this story feels familiar, if you've ever been in a relationship where everything looked fine but something felt quietly wrong, you're not alone. Take a moment and tell me in the comments, do you think silence protects relationships or slowly harms them? If stories like this speak to you, stories about real love, real struggles, and real life lessons, please like this video and subscribe to Love Stories by Mr. Johnson. These stories are told for people who feel deeply, love quietly, and are still learning how to speak their truth. And if you know someone who might see themselves in this story, share it with them. Let's continue. Evan learned early that noise was never just noise. It was a warning. As a child, he could tell what kind of evening it would be by the way the front door closed. If it shut softly, there might be laughter later. If it slammed, sharp and final, he knew better than to come out of his room. He learned to listen for footsteps too. Heavy steps meant anger hadn't burned off yet. Light ones meant exhaustion, which was safer. Silence, though, that was the most dangerous kind. Silence meant something was brewing. His parents argued in waves. Loud, crashing ones that filled the house and left no corner untouched. Evan's mother cried quietly afterward, her voice thin and apologetic, as if she were the one who had done something wrong. His father's anger always came with explanations later: stress from work, money worries, a hard life. Evan never questioned those explanations out loud. He stayed in his room, knees pulled to his chest, counting the seconds between raised voices. He learned that if he stayed quiet enough, small enough, the storm passed faster. Silence didn't fix anything, but it kept things from getting worse. By the time he was 10, he knew how to disappear without leaving the room. School noticed his calm before anything else. Teachers praised him for being well-behaved, mature beyond his years. They didn't see the way he flinched when voices rose in the hallway, or how his stomach tightened during group discussions where disagreement was encouraged. At home, he became the peacekeeper without realizing it. He brought his mother water after arguments. He avoided his father's eyes on bad days. He kept his opinions neatly folded away. Silence became a language he spoke fluently. In high school, Evan was the boy people trusted. Friends confided in him because he listened. Girlfriends described him as easy, steady, someone who never caused drama. He thought that was a compliment. When arguments came, and they always did, he learned how to smooth them over, apologize first, even when he didn't fully understand what he'd done. Especially then. It was easier than risking the volume rising. By college, Evan had mastered the art of being agreeable. Professors liked him. Roommates liked him. He kept his space clean, his emotions contained. When group projects got tense, he mediated. When relationships ended, they ended quietly. One girlfriend once told him, "I never know what you're really feeling." He smiled and said, "I guess I'm just easygoing." What he didn't say was that feelings to him still felt like matches. Useful, only if handled carefully. Dangerous if dropped. The first time he lost his temper as an adult, it terrified him. It was something small. A missed deadline, a careless comment from a coworker. The anger rose fast and hot, catching him off guard. He slammed his hand on the desk before he could stop himself. The sound echoed. He apologized immediately. Over and over. His heart raced long after the moment passed. That night, he lay awake replaying it, convinced he'd seen a glimpse of his father in himself. From then on, Evan doubled down on control. When he met Marisol, her quiet felt like relief. She didn't push. She didn't pry. She noticed things, yes. But she didn't demand explanations. With her, silence wasn't charged. It was soft. He didn't realize how deeply that mattered to him. Their early conversations were careful, thoughtful. She asked questions that felt safe. When he hesitated, she waited. He told himself that meant she understood. What he didn't recognize was how often he used that understanding as an excuse to stay hidden. In marriage, Evan prided himself on being reliable. He paid bills on time. He remembered birthdays. He showed up. He told himself that love was proven through consistency, not confession. When stress built up, at work, in life, he absorbed it quietly. He believed that sharing fear would only burden Marisol, that voicing frustration would risk conflict, that silence was a gift he could give her. He didn't see how often she looked at him, searching for something he wasn't offering. Evan sat at his desk late one evening, long after his coworkers had gone home. The office was dark except for the glow of his screen. He stared at an email he'd written and rewritten without sending. It wasn't angry. It wasn't dramatic. It was honest. That was what stopped him. He closed the laptop instead. On the drive home, the radio played softly, but his thoughts were loud. He rehearsed conversations he never planned to have. He imagined saying, "I'm scared." He imagined saying, "I don't always know how to be here." Each time he imagined the aftermath. Confusion, disappointment, noise. When he walked through the front door, Marisol looked up and smiled. The familiar calm settled over him like a blanket. "Long day?" she asked. "Yeah," he said. She nodded. "Dinner's almost ready." Relief washed through him. The script held. Later that night as they lay in bed, Evan stared into the dark, aware of the distance between his thoughts and his voice. He wondered briefly, when silence had stopped being a choice and become a reflex. The question made him uncomfortable. He pushed it away. Silence, after all, had always kept him safe. Or so he believed. Evan didn't remember the first time he decided not to say something. There was no clear moment where he chose silence and rejected honesty. It happened the way habits usually do, quietly, repeatedly, until it felt like instinct instead of decision. In his early 20s, he dated a woman named Claire, who laughed loudly and spoke freely. She believed arguments were healthy, that raised voices meant people cared enough to fight. Evan tried to match her energy at first. He listened, nodded, offered calm explanations. But every disagreement left him feeling drained, shaken in ways he couldn't explain. One night, after a small argument about nothing in particular, Claire threw her hands up and said, "Why are you so calm all the time? Don't you ever get mad?" Evan shrugged. "I don't see the point." She stared at him, frustration sharpening her voice. "The point is that I want to know you're here." The conversation ended the way many did, with Claire apologizing for getting emotional and Evan reassuring her that everything was fine. But something had shifted. He learned then that calm made people back down. Silence ended conversations faster than honesty ever could. When the relationship eventually faded out, it did so without a fight. Claire accused him once, softly, of being unreachable. Evan accepted the criticism without protest. He told himself they just weren't compatible. By the time he married Marisol, Evan believed he had finally found someone who understood his way of loving. Someone who didn't demand explanations or emotional displays. Someone who accepted him as he was. What he didn't understand was how much of himself he'd never offered. At work, his reputation continued to grow. Managers trusted him with responsibility because he didn't complain. He absorbed pressure quietly, handled conflicts diplomatically, never raised his voice. When promotions came, they came with more hours and more stress, but also more praise. "You're unflappable," his boss once told him. Evan smiled. He liked that word. It sounded like strength. But the truth was, he flapped plenty, just inwardly. On particularly hard days, he felt the tension settle behind his eyes, in his shoulders, in the steady clench of his jaw. He carried it home with him, setting it down carefully so it wouldn't spill into his marriage. Marisol never asked him to share. That was part of why he loved her. She sensed when he was tired and gave him space. She didn't push for details. She didn't turn his silence into an accusation. Evan mistook that gentleness for complete understanding. What he didn't see were the moments she paused, waiting for more. One evening, months before the kettle screamed itself hoarse, Evan came home later than usual. Marisol was already in the kitchen, cooking quietly. "You okay?" she asked when she saw his face. He hesitated. "Just for a second." "Yeah," he said. "Just busy." She nodded, accepting the answer. But as she turned back to the stove, Evan noticed something flicker across her expression. It was gone almost immediately, like a reflection on glass. He thought about asking her what she'd seen. He didn't. Later that night, Evan lay awake, staring at the ceiling fan as it turned slowly overhead. His thoughts drifted to his father, older now, quieter, the anger dulled by time and regret. They spoke occasionally, carefully. Their conversations stayed polite, shallow, safe. Evan wondered if this was how patterns survived, by softening just enough to look harmless. The thought unsettled him. The next morning, he woke early again, slipping out of bed without waking Marisol. He moved through the house quietly, intentionally. He told himself it was kindness. But as he stood in the doorway, watching her sleep, a different realization surfaced. He didn't know how to wake her with the truth. The idea of saying, "I don't always know how to be close to you," felt overwhelming. He imagined her face changing, imagined disappointment settling in. He imagined the quiet breaking, and didn't trust himself to manage what followed. So he left for work instead. As the weeks passed, Evan became more aware of the distance. Not because it was growing rapidly, but because it was steady, predictable, like erosion. He noticed how Marisol laughed less often, how she spent more time alone in the spare room, even if she wasn't doing anything in particular, how she answered his questions with the same careful neutrality he used himself. One night she asked him, "Do you ever miss anything?" The question caught him off guard. "Like what?" he asked. She shrugged. "I don't know, just anything." Evan searched for the right response. He wanted to say no. He wanted to say he was content. But the truth sat heavier. "I guess everyone misses something," he said instead. She smiled faintly. "Yeah. I guess so." The conversation ended there, neither of them satisfied, neither of them certain why. Evan told himself he was protecting them. Protecting their peace. Protecting the calm they had built together. He believed that love meant minimizing harm, avoiding disruption, keeping things steady. What he didn't yet understand was that stability without honesty can quietly hollow out a relationship. One afternoon, while driving home in heavy traffic, Evan felt anger rise again, sharp and sudden. A car cut him off. His heart raced. His hands tightened on the steering wheel. For a brief moment, he imagined yelling, letting the feeling out. Instead, he exhaled slowly and forced himself to relax. By the time he reached home, the anger was gone, replaced by exhaustion. Marisol greeted him at the door, smiling softly. He hugged her, holding on a little longer than usual. She leaned into him, then pulled back, studying his face. "You sure you're okay?" she asked. Evan opened his mouth. He almost told her everything. Instead, he smiled. Yeah. That night, as they sat together in silence, Evan felt the familiar comfort settle in. But underneath it, something else stirred, something restless and uncertain. For the first time, he wondered whether silence was still keeping him safe, or whether it was quietly costing him the one person he didn't want to lose. Marisol grew up in a house that looked warm from the outside. The windows were always clean. Curtains opened early, closed neatly at night. Her mother kept fresh flowers on the table whenever she could, small deliberate beauties pressed into simple vases. There was laughter in that house too. Plenty of it. Stories told over dinner. Jokes repeated until everyone groaned. But there were rules no one ever said out loud. You didn't ask why her mother went quiet after certain phone calls. You didn't ask why her father stayed late at work even when he didn't have to. And you never asked what hurt. When something went wrong, it was smoothed over quickly. A tight smile. A gentle wave of the hand. "It's fine," her mother would say, the words light and practiced, like setting a lid gently over a boiling pot. Marisol learned early that love meant endurance. She watched her mother absorb disappointments without complaint. Missed anniversaries. Broken promises. Dreams quietly adjusted, until they fit the space allowed. Her mother never cried loudly. She cried privately, in bathrooms with the fan running, in the car with the radio turned up. When Marisol asked once, timidly, if everything really was fine, her mother smiled and brushed her hair back. "Some things are just not worth stirring up," she said. Marisol took that lesson seriously. At school, she was thoughtful and observant. Teachers praised her maturity. Friends leaned on her because she listened without interrupting. She learned how to make herself useful in quiet ways, remembering birthdays, noticing moods, smoothing tensions before they escalated. She didn't demand much in return. In her first serious relationship, she believed she had done everything right. She was patient, understanding, undemanding. She never raised her voice. She never asked questions that might make things uncomfortable. When he left, he did it quickly. No argument. No explanation. Just a conversation that ended with, "I think I need something different." Marisol nodded. She smiled. She said she understood. She went home and sat on her bed for hours, staring at the wall, replaying every moment she might have missed. Every question she hadn't asked. The silence afterward was worse than any argument could have been. She waited for closure that never came. Waited for a message. A reason. Something she could hold on to and make sense of. Nothing arrived. Eventually, she decided the waiting was the problem. From then on, Marisol stopped asking questions she wasn't sure she wanted the answers to. She told herself that expectations were dangerous things. That wanting too much was how people got hurt. When she met Evan, his calm felt familiar. Comforting. He didn't overwhelm her with emotion or demand constant reassurance. He noticed small things. He remembered details. He listened. And when she went quiet, he didn't chase her into the silence. It felt respectful. With Evan, she didn't have to explain herself. She didn't have to dig into feelings that felt messy and uncertain. Their relationship grew gently, without friction, without urgency. She told herself this was what healthy love looked like. As years passed, Marisol settled into routines with the same careful grace she'd learned at home. She kept the house warm. She kept things running smoothly. She made space for Evan's stress without asking too many questions. When she began to feel restless, she dismissed it. When painting started to feel less important, she told herself, people changed. When quiet moments stretched a little too long, she filled them with tasks. She was very good at being fine. But sometimes, late at night, she felt a hollow place open in her chest. A soft ache she couldn't name. It wasn't unhappiness exactly. It was more like absence. Like something that should have been there and wasn't. She didn't talk about it. She told herself that bringing it up would only create problems. That Evan would worry. That things might become complicated. Silence, after all, had always kept things together. One afternoon, while folding laundry, Marisol found an old paint-smudged shirt tucked at the back of a drawer. She held it up, fingers tracing the stiffened fabric where color had once soaked through. She couldn't remember the last time she'd worn it. For a moment, she considered throwing it away. Instead, she folded it carefully and put it back. That evening, when Evan came home late, she smiled and asked about his day. He answered briefly, tired but kind. They ate dinner together, the television filling the gaps. Marisol watched him from across the room, noticing the familiar curve of his shoulders, the slight furrow in his brow. She felt a sudden urge to ask him something real. Something risky. The moment passed. She told herself tomorrow would be better. Silence had taught her patience. She didn't yet realize how much it was teaching her to disappear. As a teenager, Marisol learned how to be easy to love. She watched the way her mother anticipated needs before they were spoken. How she adjusted herself quietly to fit the emotional weather of the room. When her father was tired, her mother spoke less. When he was distant, she filled the space with small kindnesses instead of questions. Marisol absorbed all of it. At school she became the friend everyone liked, because she never demanded too much. She remembered details. She offered support. She didn't push for explanations when people pulled away. Her presence was comforting, steady, undemanding. It earned her affection. But it also taught her something dangerous. That love was something you earned by not asking for more. When she left for college, Marisol carried that lesson with her. She chose relationships where she could be helpful, understanding, patient. She mistook emotional restraint for emotional maturity. The breakup that followed her first serious relationship confirmed what she already believed. When he left without explanation, Marisol didn't confront him. She didn't ask for clarity. She swallowed the confusion, and told herself that closure was a luxury some people didn't get. She promised herself she would never put herself in that position again. With Evan, everything felt calmer, safer. Their silences didn't feel like abandonment. They felt like understanding. He didn't pry into her thoughts, and she didn't press into his. They existed side by side, comfortable in the quiet. When they married, Marisol believed they had found something rare. A love without turbulence. She didn't notice, at first, how much of herself she was slowly packing away. Painting had always been where Marisol went when words failed her. Colors expressed what she couldn't articulate. On canvas, she allowed herself to be messy, uncertain, bold. In the early years of their marriage, she painted often. Evan watched her sometimes, leaning against the doorway, smiling softly. He told her he liked how focused she looked. How alive. At some point, she started to feel self-conscious. The paintings felt private, vulnerable. She wondered if they took up too much space. She painted less. No one asked her to stop. She just did. The spare room became a place she passed through instead of lingered in. Her brushes dried out. Her canvases leaned untouched against the wall. She told herself she was just busy. That phase is past. But the ache returned anyway. One night, lying in bed beside Evan, she turned onto her side and studied his face in the dim light. He looked peaceful, grounded. She wondered what it would be like to disturb that calm. The thought filled her with guilt. She didn't want to be the reason things became complicated. Instead, she reached for his hand and held it quietly, hoping the closeness would say what she couldn't. Sometimes it did. Sometimes it didn't. As the months passed, Marisol became more aware of how often she answered questions with, "It's fine," how frequently she redirected conversations away from herself, how she filled silences with practical concerns instead of emotional ones. She didn't feel unhappy. But she didn't feel seen either. The difference mattered. One afternoon while cleaning, she found a stack of old sketchbooks tucked away in a box. She sat on the floor and flipped through them slowly. Each page held a version of herself she barely recognized. Bold strokes, unfinished ideas, feelings that had once demanded expression. Tears surprised her. She wiped them away quickly, standing up as if caught doing something wrong. That evening, when Evan came home, she considered telling him what she'd found. Considered telling him how much she missed painting. How much she missed feeling like herself. The words formed, then dissolved. She told him about a sale at the grocery store instead. As they ate dinner, Evan talked about work. Marisol listened attentively, nodding, asking questions. She was very good at listening. What she didn't realize was that over time, listening without being heard had begun to feel like loneliness. That night, as they sat on the couch, the television flickering quietly, Marisol felt the familiar distance settle between them. Not dramatic. Not painful. Just present. She leaned her head against Evan's shoulder. He rested his chin lightly on her hair. For a moment, it felt like enough. But later, lying awake in the dark, Marisol stared at the ceiling and acknowledged something she'd been avoiding. Silence had taught her how to endure. It had never taught her how to ask. And endurance, she was beginning to understand, was not the same as fulfillment. When Evan and Marisol first met, neither of them noticed how quiet the other was. Or maybe they noticed and felt relieved. They met on a mild evening in early spring, the kind where the air still carried a hint of winter but promised something better. A mutual friend had invited them both to a small gathering, nothing loud, nothing crowded. Just a handful of people, soft music, conversations overlapping gently instead of competing. Marisol arrived early, as she always did. She stood near the window, sipping a drink, watching people arrive. Evan came in a few minutes later, scanning the room the way he always did, automatically, carefully, before settling near the wall. They noticed each other without urgency. When they finally spoke, it was because no one else was standing close enough to fill the silence. "This place always feels smaller than it is," Marisol said, nodding toward the room. Evan glanced around, then smiled. "Yeah. Like it's holding its breath." She looked at him then, really looked at him, surprised by the accuracy of the comment. That's exactly it. Their conversation unfolded slowly. No rapid-fire questions. No forced charm. They talked about ordinary things. Music, work, the city. But each pause felt intentional rather than awkward. When one of them stopped speaking, the other didn't rush to fill the space. That alone felt like connection. Their first date was a walk by the river. The sky dimmed gradually, the water reflecting the soft glow of streetlights. They walked side by side, hands occasionally brushing, their steps falling into an easy rhythm. Marisol noticed how Evan watched the path ahead, alert but relaxed. Evan noticed how Marisol counted her steps when crossing bridges, slowing slightly at the halfway point. They didn't comment on these things. They stored them away. With Evan, Marisol felt no pressure to perform. She didn't feel the need to be brighter or louder or more interesting. He listened without interrupting, smiled without expectation. When she went quiet, he didn't ask what she was thinking. She took that as respect. With Marisol, Evan felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: ease. He didn't worry about saying the wrong thing. She didn't push him into emotional corners he wasn't ready to explore. When he chose his words carefully, she waited. He took that as understanding. They spent more time together after that. Coffee shops where they read side by side. Grocery store trips where they debated brands quietly. Long drives with music playing low, conversation drifting in and out. They learned each other through proximity rather than confession. Evan learned how Marisol liked her coffee and which songs made her nostalgic. Marisol learned which streets Evan avoided when traffic got heavy and how he relaxed when he cooked. Love crept in unnoticed. It arrived through routine, Sunday mornings that stretched lazily, evenings spent sharing meals without distraction. There was no dramatic moment where one of them declared their feelings. No grand realization. One night, as they sat on the couch watching rain streak the windows, Evan reached for Marisol's hand without thinking. She squeezed back, equally unthinking. Neither of them commented on it. They moved in together a year later. The decision felt obvious, natural. Their lives already fit together neatly. Marisol's things blended easily with Evan's. Her books found space on his shelves. His habits adjusted around hers. They didn't argue much. When disagreements arose, they were handled quietly, efficiently. Compromises were made quickly, often before either of them felt strongly enough to resist. Friends commented on how compatible they were. "You two never fight," someone said once. Marisol smiled. Evan shrugged. Neither corrected them. On their wedding day, the ceremony was simple, intimate. No dramatic vows, just promises spoken clearly and calmly. Evan's hands trembled slightly as he slid the ring onto Marisol's finger. She noticed. She squeezed his hand, grounding him. The gesture meant more to him than any speech could have. Married life unfolded gently. They settled into roles without discussion. Evan took care of logistics. Marisol took care of atmosphere. They both took care not to disrupt the balance they'd built. At night they lay together in comfortable quiet, sometimes talking, often not. The silence felt earned, deserved. Neither of them questioned it. They believed they had found something rare, a love that didn't demand constant explanation. A partnership built on mutual consideration, a life without unnecessary noise. What they didn't see was how easily shared silence could turn into shared avoidance. For now, though, it felt like harmony. And harmony, when you've known chaos or abandonment, can feel like everything. In the beginning, the quiet felt like a gift. Evan and Marisol learned each other's rhythms the way people learn a favorite song, without thinking too much about it. They woke at similar times, moved through mornings with minimal words, shared meals that felt unhurried, even when time was short. They rarely argued. When disagreements surfaced, they were handled with care. Evan softened his opinions before voicing them. Marisol adjusted hers before they ever became firm. Each believed they were being considerate. Neither noticed how often they were choosing peace over truth. They spent evenings together in companionable silence. Marisol read while Evan worked on his laptop. Sometimes he'd glance over and catch her chewing thoughtfully on her lip, fully absorbed in a paragraph. Sometimes she'd look up and find him staring at nothing in particular, lost in his own thoughts. They didn't interrupt those moments. It felt respectful. On weekends they walked through the neighborhood, fingers loosely intertwined. Neighbors waved. Strangers smiled at them. More than once, someone commented on how calm they seemed together. "You two are so solid," a friend said during a dinner party. "It's refreshing." Marisol felt a quiet pride at that. Evan did too. They mistook stability for depth. As the years passed, the silences grew longer, but not louder. They expanded gently, like a room slowly filling with furniture, until movement became limited without anyone noticing how it happened. Marisol stopped painting in stages. First, she painted only on weekends. Then, only when she felt particularly inspired. Eventually, she told herself inspiration would come back when things slowed down. Things never did. Evan noticed vaguely that the spare room stayed closed more often. He noticed paint stains fading from her clothes. He assumed it was a phase. She assumed he didn't mind. At work, Evan's responsibilities increased. He came home later, more often tired than talkative. Marisol adjusted dinner times. She asked fewer questions. She told herself this was partnership. Sometimes, late at night, she lay awake listening to Evan's breathing, wondering when they had stopped talking about dreams. When conversations had shifted from what they wanted to what needed to be done. The question made her uneasy. So she didn't linger on it. Evan felt the shift too, though he couldn't have explained it if asked. Something felt quieter than it should have been. Not peaceful, just muted. He told himself this was adulthood. This was marriage. He had no reference point for anything else. When Marisol grew distant, he assumed she was content. When Evan withdrew, Marisol assumed he needed space. Their assumptions fit neatly together, leaving no room for challenge. They loved each other. That much was true. But love, unspoken, began to feel fragile. One night, while clearing the table, Marisol dropped a plate. It shattered loudly against the floor, the sound sharp and sudden in the quiet house. She froze. Evan startled, heart racing. For a split second, panic surged, old and familiar. "It's okay," he said quickly, too quickly. "I'll clean it." Marisol watched him kneel, hands steady as he gathered the pieces. She noticed how controlled he looked. How focused. "I can help," she said. "No, it's fine," he replied. The words landed heavier than he intended. Marisol stepped back, arms folding loosely around herself. The moment passed. The mess disappeared. The quiet returned. But something lingered. Later, lying in bed, Marisol stared into the dark and realized how often Fine had replaced honesty in their life together. She wondered what would happen if she said more. Evan lay beside her, eyes open, replaying the sound of the plate breaking. The sharpness of it, the way his body had reacted before his mind could catch up. He wondered how much of himself he was still hiding. Neither spoke. The silence held. And for the first time both of them sensed, without yet admitting it, that love built only on what goes unsaid, eventually begins to ask for a voice. Marriage settled into their lives the way dust settles on furniture, slowly, invisibly, until it simply became part of the room. Evan and Marisol didn't wake up one morning and decide who they would be to each other. The roles formed on their own, shaped by habit and instinct. Evan handled the bills, the calendars, the repairs. Marisol handled the warmth of the house, the meals, the invitations, the quiet emotional maintenance no one ever named. It worked. For a long time it worked well. They moved through their days with efficiency and care, rarely stepping on each other's toes. When decisions needed to be made, They made them quickly, often without discussion. It felt like understanding, like being on the same wavelength. When Evan took a promotion that came with longer hours, he told Marisol it was temporary. She told him she understood. Neither of them examined what temporary really meant. When Marisol declined an invitation to show her art at a local gallery, she didn't mention it. Evan never knew there had been an invitation at all. They assumed each other's silence meant agreement. On weeknights, Evan came home later and later, shoulders heavy with responsibility. Marisol adjusted dinner times without complaint, reheated plates, left notes when she went to bed early. She told herself this was what support looked like. Evan noticed the notes and felt grateful. He didn't consider that gratitude might not be enough. They still touched, still shared space, still laughed at the same shows. But the laughter came easier than the conversations that followed. Sometimes Evan would catch Marisol watching him, her expression unreadable. He wondered if she was tired, or bored, or simply lost in thought. He didn't ask. Sometimes, Marisol would hear Evan sigh softly in the kitchen, a sound he probably didn't realize he made. She wondered what weight he carried. She didn't press. They both believed they were being kind. On weekends, they hosted friends. Their home was warm, inviting. People lingered at the table, commented on how comfortable the place felt. "You two make marriage look easy," someone said once, raising a glass. Evan smiled politely. Marisol felt something twist in her chest. Easy wasn't the word she would have chosen. Later that night, after the guests had left and the dishes were done, Marisol leaned against the counter, watching Evan dry his hands. "Do you ever feel like we're just managing?" she asked, her voice careful. Evan paused, towel in hand. The question surprised him. Not because it was confrontational, but because it brushed against something he hadn't given a name to. "I think that's part of it," he said slowly. "Life gets busy." She nodded. "Yeah. I guess." The conversation ended there, unfinished. Both of them felt it. The incompleteness. But neither reached back for it. That night, Evan lay awake longer than usual. He thought about the word managing. It sounded responsible. Adult. It also sounded like something people did to problems, not relationships. He told himself he was overthinking. Marisol lay awake too, staring at the dark, replaying the moment. She wondered if she should have said more. If she should have explained what she meant. She told herself it wasn't worth stirring up. The days continued. Marisol's world grew quieter in ways she didn't immediately recognize. She stopped talking about her inner life because it felt unnecessary. Evan's world grew heavier, filled with obligations he never shared. They still loved each other, that was never in question. But slowly, subtly, love became something they maintained rather than explored. And without meaning to, they began replacing conversations with assumptions, believing they already knew what the other felt, what the other needed, what the other could handle. It felt efficient. It also felt lonely. Neither of them said that part out loud. The longer they stayed quiet, the more natural it felt. Silence had a way of rewarding them at first. It kept things running smoothly. It prevented arguments. It allowed them to move through their days without friction. When Evan came home exhausted, Marisol didn't add weight to his shoulders. When Marisol felt distant, Evan didn't demand explanations she didn't have the energy to give. They told themselves this was maturity, but beneath that calm small things began to slip through unnoticed. Marisol started waking earlier, not because she needed to, but because sleep came less easily. She lay still beside Evan, listening to the rhythm of his breathing, wondering what thoughts lived behind the calm face he showed the world. She wondered if he ever felt lonely lying next to her. She never asked. Evan noticed the way Marisol sometimes lingered in doorways, as if deciding whether to enter a room or retreat from it. He noticed how she smiled more quickly now, how the smile didn't always reach her eyes. He told himself she was tired. He told himself it would pass. He didn't bring it up. They still shared meals, still coordinated schedules, still checked in about the practical details of life. But conversations about feelings, about fears, about wants, felt increasingly distant, like something they used to do in another lifetime. One evening, Evan came home later than usual. Marisol was already in bed, the light off, her back turned toward his side. He stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her silhouette in the dark. "I'm sorry I'm late," he said softly. She shifted slightly. "It's okay." He waited, unsure what he was waiting for. When nothing followed, he undressed quietly and slipped into bed. As he lay there, staring into the darkness, Evan realized something that unsettled him. He couldn't remember the last time they'd had a conversation that surprised him. Everything felt predictable now. Safe. And somehow smaller. Marisol felt him settle beside her, and closed her eyes tighter, though she hadn't been asleep. She wondered if he sensed the distance too. If he felt the quiet stretching thinner each day. She considered turning around. Saying something real. Telling him she felt like she was fading in her own life. The words stayed locked behind her teeth. She told herself tomorrow would be better. Tomorrow always felt safer. On Saturday mornings, they still walked the neighborhood together. Coffee mugs in hand, shoulders brushing. Neighbors waved. Dogs barked. The world continued, as if nothing were wrong. "You two are always together," a woman down the street said once, smiling warmly. Marisol smiled back. Evan nodded. The comment lingered with Marisol long after the walk ended. Always together. The phrase sounded comforting. It also sounded incomplete. Together didn't always mean connected. That afternoon, Marisol stood in the spare room, surrounded by boxes she'd promised herself she'd organize someday. She opened one at random, and found old art supplies, tubes of paint hardened with age, brushes splayed and stiff. She sat on the floor, holding one of the brushes, memories flooding back. The feeling of color on canvas. The way time disappeared when she painted. The sense of being fully present in herself. A lump formed in her throat. She didn't cry. She simply set the brush down and closed the box again. Evan spent the afternoon fixing a leaky faucet, focused and methodical. He liked tasks with clear outcomes. Problems that could be solved without emotional uncertainty. When he finished, he felt a brief sense of accomplishment. It faded quickly. That evening, they sat on the couch again, the familiar distance between them. Marisol flipped through a magazine without reading. Evan scrolled through his phone, pausing on nothing. At one point, their eyes met. Something flickered there, recognition maybe. Or longing. Evan almost spoke. Marisol almost did too. The moment passed. Silence filled the space where honesty might have lived. As the night wore on, both of them felt the same quiet realization settle in, unspoken and heavy. They were still together. They were still kind to each other. They were still in love, in the way you remain in love with something familiar and dependable. But somewhere along the way, without argument or betrayal, loneliness had begun to live between them. And neither of them knew how to evict it. Sometimes relationships don't break because of betrayal or betrayal. They weaken because of assumptions. Take a moment and reflect with me. Have you ever assumed someone was okay, only to realize later they weren't? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Your experience might help someone else feel seen. If you're finding meaning in this story and the lessons it carries, please like this video and subscribe to Love Stories by Mr. Johnson. These stories aren't just meant to entertain, they're meant to remind us what love quietly asks of us before it's too late. Let's continue. Loneliness didn't arrive all at once. It crept in quietly. The way fog settles over a familiar road. Slow enough that you don't notice until you're already deep inside it. For Evan and Marisol, it showed up in the smallest places. In the way mornings felt rushed even when they weren't. In the way evenings ended without anything worth remembering. In the way they sat beside each other, close enough to touch, yet careful not to disturb the fragile calm they'd built. Marisol began to feel it most in the afternoons. The house felt different when Evan wasn't there. Not empty, just still. She moved through the rooms, straightening things that were already neat, wiping counters that were already clean. Tasks filled time but not the space inside her. She'd pause sometimes in the hallway, unsure where she was headed, as if she'd forgotten the reason she stood up in the first place. Loneliness didn't feel dramatic. It felt dull. Persistent. She told herself she was being ungrateful. She had a good life, a kind husband, stability, safety. Everything she was taught to value. So why did she feel like she was slowly fading? At work, her coworkers chatted about weekend plans, frustrations, dreams. Marisol listened more than she spoke. When asked how she was doing, she answered the same way she always did. "I'm fine." The words felt automatic, hollow. Evan felt the loneliness differently. For him, it surfaced late at night, when the house finally went quiet, and there was nothing left to manage or fix. He'd sit at the edge of the bed, scrolling through his phone without absorbing anything, feeling an unshakable restlessness he couldn't name. He missed something, but he didn't know what. Sometimes he glanced toward the spare room, remembering how Marisol used to spend hours there, emerging with paint on her hands and a lightness in her step. He wondered why that version of her felt so far away. He wondered if it had anything to do with him. But wondering was easier than asking. One evening, Evan came home earlier than usual. Marisol was surprised to see him, standing in the kitchen with her sleeves rolled up. "Oh," she said. "You're home." "Yeah," he replied. "Meeting got cancelled." She smiled, but the moment felt oddly awkward, like they'd both been interrupted mid-thought. They cooked together, side by side, exchanging small comments about the day. It should have felt nice. It used to. Instead, Marisol felt a strange pressure in her chest, like something important was being avoided. When dinner was ready, they sat across from each other, the table between them feeling wider than usual. Evan noticed she barely touched her food. "You're not hungry?" he asked. She hesitated. "I guess not." He nodded, accepting the answer. But the hesitation stayed with him, gnawing at the edges of his calm. After dinner, they moved to the couch. The television played quietly, casting flickering light across the room. Marisol leaned into the corner, pulling her legs close to herself. Evan sat with his hands clasped, elbows resting on his knees. They were in the same room. They were not together. Marisol watched Evan out of the corner of her eye. She wondered if he noticed how distant she felt. If he ever felt it too. The question burned softly, insistently. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. Evan sensed the movement beside him, the almost speech. His heart rate picked up. He waited, ready, finally, to listen. Nothing came. The silence returned, heavier now because it had been challenged. Later that night, Marisol lay awake, staring at the ceiling. She thought about her mother, about all the years she'd smiled through disappointment. She wondered if this was what love looked like when you did everything right. If this was as good as it got. Evan lay beside her, equally awake, staring into the dark. He thought about his father, about how anger had ruined so much. He wondered if avoiding conflict had cost him something just as precious. They both felt it then, the same realization, sharp and undeniable. Loneliness doesn't always come from being alone. Sometimes, it comes from being unseen. And sometimes, it lives right beside you. The strange thing about loneliness was how easily it hid behind routine. Evan and Marisol still woke at the same time. Still shared coffee in the kitchen. Still asked each other about their day. The words were there, but they skimmed the surface, careful not to sink. They had become experts at functional conversation. How was work? Busy? Long day? Yeah. The exchanges kept things moving, but they didn't carry meaning. They were placeholders, filling the space where something deeper might have gone. Marisol noticed how tired Evan looked lately. The slight slump in his shoulders, the way his jaw stayed clenched even when he tried to relax. She wanted to ask what weighed on him. She didn't know how to start. Evan noticed how quiet Marisol had become. Not silent, she still spoke, still laughed when expected, but quieter in a way that felt different. Like she was slowly retreating into herself. He told himself he was imagining it. One Saturday afternoon, they ran errands together. At the hardware store, Evan examined shelves while Marisol wandered through the aisles without purpose. She stopped in front of a display of picture frames, lifting one and turning it over in her hands. Evan noticed and walked over. "Find something?" She shook her head. "Just looking." He nodded, satisfied. They moved on. Marisol set the frame back carefully. She didn't know why it had caught her attention. Perhaps she'd imagined something inside it, a moment, a memory, a version of their life that felt more present. On the drive home, the radio played softly. Evan kept his eyes on the road. Marisol watched the city pass by, feeling the distance stretch even in the small space of the car. She wanted to tell him she felt lonely. The word felt heavy, accusatory, like it would sound as if she were blaming him. So she stayed quiet. Evan wanted to ask her what she was thinking. The question felt invasive, risky, like it might open a door he didn't know how to close. So he stayed quiet too. That evening, Marisol stood in the spare room again, the box of art supplies now closer to the door than it used to be. She hadn't moved it consciously. It just seemed to migrate toward her attention, calling softly. She opened it this time. The smell of old paint hit her first, faint, familiar. She picked up a brush, running her fingers over the stiff bristles. A wave of longing rose in her chest, sharp and unexpected. She imagined setting up the easel again. Imagined color returning to the room. She imagined Evan watching from the doorway, saying something encouraging. The image felt fragile, uncertain. She closed the box. Evan spent the evening balancing their accounts at the kitchen table. Numbers made sense to him. They added up. They resolved. They didn't hide things. As he worked, he noticed the spare room door open. He glanced down the hallway, curiosity stirring. He wondered what Marisol did in there now. He didn't ask. When she joined him later, he looked up. "Everything okay?" She hesitated. "Yeah." The word landed between them, familiar and final. They went to bed early, exhaustion settling over them like a blanket. In the dark, Evan reached for Marisol's hand. She took it, squeezing gently. The touch comforted them both. But comfort, they were beginning to understand, wasn't the same as closeness. As sleep finally came, both of them carried the same quiet fear. That something important was slipping away, not because of cruelty or neglect, but because of all the words they were afraid to say. Fear had a way of disguising itself as responsibility. For Evan, it showed up as restraint. He told himself he stayed quiet because he was being thoughtful, because he didn't want to burden Marisol with stress she didn't deserve. Because love in his mind meant absorbing discomfort so the other person didn't have to. But underneath that logic lived something older and less noble. Fear. It surfaced most clearly when anger brushed too close. One evening at work, a junior colleague made a careless mistake that cost Evan hours of extra work. By the time Evan noticed, it was already late. The office was nearly empty, the lights dimmed. The irritation flared quickly, hot and sharp. Evan felt it rise in his chest, tightening his jaw, quickening his pulse. His hands curled into fists before he realized it. For a brief, terrifying second, he imagined raising his voice. Imagined the sound of it echoing in the room. The image stopped him cold. He forced his hands open. Took a slow breath. Another. "It's fine," he told himself quietly. He fixed the mistake without comment. Sent a polite email. Smoothed things over. His coworker thanked him the next day, relieved. Evan smiled. Inside, the anger had nowhere to go. He carried it home with him, invisible and contained, like he carried everything else. That night, as Marisol talked about her day, Evan nodded and listened, his responses appropriate but distant. She noticed. She always did. She sensed when his mind was elsewhere, when something weighed on him. "You sure you're okay?" she asked gently. The question made his chest tighten. He wanted to say no. He wanted to say, "I'm afraid of what I feel when I don't stay in control." He wanted to say, "I don't trust myself with anger." He wanted to say, "I don't know how to be honest without hurting you." Instead, he said what he always did. "I'm just tired." Marisol accepted the answer, though it didn't quite settle. She watched him closely as he stood to clear the table, noticing how stiff his movements were, how careful. She wondered how much of himself he carried alone. She wondered if she was allowed to ask. Later, lying in bed, Evan stared at the ceiling, his mind replaying the day. The moment of anger. The way it had scared him. He thought about his father again. About slammed doors and raised voices and apologies that came too late. Evan promised himself, as he always did, that he would never be that man. What he didn't realize was how much fear that promise cost him. Marisol felt the cost in a different way. For her, it appeared as a quiet sense of invisibility. She had become very good at supporting Evan, adjusting to his schedule, anticipating his moods, giving him space when he needed it. She did it without resentment. At least at first. But slowly, something inside her began to ache. She noticed how often conversations revolved around Evan's work, Evan's stress, Evan's responsibilities. She listened, offered comfort, nodded at the right moments. When she talked about herself, she kept it light, surface level, manageable. She couldn't remember the last time she'd spoken about her dreams without minimizing them. One afternoon, while sorting through mail, Marisol found a flyer for a local art show. She stared at it longer than she meant to. The image on the front, a bold wash of color, stirred something deep in her chest. She imagined herself there. Imagined standing beside her work again. Imagined feeling seen. The thought made her heart race. It also made her feel selfish. She folded the flyer and tucked it into a drawer. When Evan came home that evening, she smiled and asked about his day. He told her about a meeting that went long, about deadlines, about responsibilities. She listened. At one point, she opened her mouth to tell him about the flyer. She closed it again. The pattern repeated itself, day after day. Evan swallowed his fear. Marisol swallowed her longing. Both believed they were protecting the other. Neither realized how much they were losing themselves in the process. One night as they sat together in silence, Marisol suddenly felt tears sting her eyes. The feeling came out of nowhere, sharp and unexpected. She turned away quickly, hoping Evan hadn't noticed. He had. "Hey," he said softly. "What's wrong?" The question startled her. It cracked something open. For a moment, just a moment, she considered telling him everything. Instead, she shook her head. "Nothing. I'm just tired." Evan nodded, relieved and disappointed all at once. The silence returned, heavier now because it had almost been broken. And in that quiet, both of them felt the truth pressing closer. Silence was no longer keeping them safe. It was starting to cost them pieces of themselves. The cost of silence didn't announce itself with consequences. It showed up as erosion. Marisol felt it most in the quiet moments when she was alone with herself. Folding laundry, washing dishes, sitting at red lights with the radio turned down. The loneliness crept in during those pauses, whispering questions she tried not to hear. When did I stop being someone with wants? When did I start measuring my needs by how inconvenient they might be? She didn't blame Evan. That was the hardest part. There was no villain to point to, no wrongdoing to confront. He was kind, reliable, present in all the ways that could be counted. And still, she felt unseen. One evening, while clearing the table, she caught her reflection in the darkened window. The woman staring back at her looked composed, calm, put together. She looked nothing like the woman who used to lose herself in color and motion. Marisol turned away quickly. Evan felt the erosion differently. For him, it showed up as tension without release. He carried emotions the way he carried weight, carefully balanced, never set down. The pressure built slowly, quietly, until even small things felt heavy. He noticed how easily irritation surfaced now. How often he had to pause, breathe, remind himself to stay calm. The effort exhausted him. One night, while brushing his teeth, Evan stared at his reflection and barely recognized the tightness in his own expression. He wondered when calm had stopped feeling natural and started feeling forced. He didn't know who he would be if he let go. That scared him more than anything. At work, his patience thinned. At home, his quiet deepened. Marisol noticed the change, even if she didn't name it. She responded by becoming more careful, more accommodating. They were both shrinking, each in their own way. On a Sunday afternoon, they sat together at the kitchen table, sorting through mail. A letter addressed to Marisol slipped free and landed between them. Evan glanced at it casually. "It's from the art center," he said. Marisol's heart skipped. "Oh." He held it out to her. She took it quickly, too quickly. "You still get stuff from them?" he asked. Not accusing, just curious. She nodded. "Yeah. Sometimes." He waited. She unfolded the letter slowly, scanning it without really reading. The moment stretched. "What's it about?" Evan asked. Marisol hesitated. The truth hovered right there, within reach. She could tell him about the flyer, about the longing, about the quiet grief of giving something up without ever deciding to. She folded the letter again. "Just announcements," she said. "Nothing important." Evan nodded, though something about the exchange unsettled him. He watched her tuck the letter away, noticing the carefulness in her movements. That night, the silence between them felt sharper. Marisol lay awake, replaying the moment. The ease with which she dismissed something that mattered to her. The familiarity of the choice. She wondered how many times she'd done that before. Evan lay beside her, staring into the dark, thinking about the letter, about the way she'd answered, about how little he actually knew about what lived inside her now. He wondered when curiosity had turned into caution. The next morning, Evan snapped at a coworker over a minor issue. The sound of his own voice, raised, sharp, stunned him. The room fell quiet. "I'm sorry," he said immediately, heart pounding. The apology came too fast, too automatic. The rest of the day, shame followed him. He replayed the moment again and again, fear tightening in his chest. When he came home that evening, Marisol noticed his unease right away. "Everything okay?" she asked. The question felt heavier this time, more insistent. Evan opened his mouth. He felt the words rising, fear, frustration, exhaustion. He felt the dam straining. He pictured his father, pictured Marisol's gentle calm. pictured the risk of disturbing it. "I'm fine," he said. The words tasted bitter. Marisol nodded, though disappointment flickered across her face before she masked it. She turned back to the stove, shoulders slightly hunched. Something inside her hardened quietly. That night, as they sat in silence once more, Marisol realized something that made her chest ache. She wasn't just lonely. She was disappearing. And Evan, sitting beside her, realized something just as frightening. He was afraid of himself, and it was costing him the one person he trusted most. The silence stretched between them, no longer neutral, no longer kind. It had become a barrier. And both of them knew, without saying it, that something would have to give. Assumptions had quietly taken the place of questions. Evan assumed Marisol was content because she never complained. Marisol assumed Evan was fulfilled because he never asked for more. Neither of them meant to stop being curious. Curiosity just felt dangerous now, like touching something fragile that might break if handled the wrong way. Marisol began to move through her days with a careful distance, as if she were already preparing herself for disappointment. She didn't expect Evan to notice her quiet withdrawal. In fact, part of her believed he wouldn't. That belief hurt more than she wanted to admit. One afternoon she ran into an old friend at a coffee shop. They exchanged pleasantries, the usual updates. When the friend asked how marriage was, Marisol smiled automatically. "It's good," she said. The words felt rehearsed. Her friend tilted her head slightly. "You say that like you're convincing yourself." Marisol laughed it off, but the comment followed her home like an echo. That evening, Evan came home to find Marisol sitting at the kitchen table, staring at nothing. A folded piece of paper lay in front of her. "You okay?" he asked. She looked up, startled. "Yeah. Just thinking." He nodded, accepting the answer. He didn't see the way her fingers tightened around the paper. It was the flyer from the art center. She'd taken it out again, unfolded it, folded it back up. The decision weighed heavier each time. Evan poured himself a glass of water, then hesitated. "You want one?" "No, thanks." He sat across from her, the familiar distance between them. The quiet felt thick, uncomfortable. Evan searched for something to say. Something safe. "Work's been crazy," he offered. Marisol nodded. "I figured." The response felt final, like a door closing gently. Evan felt a flicker of irritation, quickly followed by guilt. He told himself she was tired. He told himself this was just a phase. Marisol watched him carefully. She noticed how he avoided her eyes now, how his answers felt practiced. She assumed he didn't want to talk, that he preferred things this way. She told herself she was being considerate. Later that night, Evan overheard Marisol on the phone in the spare room. Her voice was low, but something about it made him pause. "I don't know," she was saying. "It just feels like I don't really exist in my own life sometimes." Evan froze. He hadn't meant to listen. But the words hit him hard, sharp and unexpected. He waited for her to say more, to explain. She didn't. The call ended. Footsteps approached. Evan moved away quickly, heart pounding. When Marisol joined him in the living room, she looked composed, as if nothing had happened. "You want to watch something?" she asked. "Sure," he replied. But his mind raced. He assumed the comment wasn't about him. It had to be about work. Or stress. Or something else entirely. The alternative, that she might be lonely with him, felt too painful to consider. Marisol sat beside him, leaving the same careful space between their bodies. She wondered if he'd heard anything. If he cared. She assumed he hadn't noticed. The television played. The room filled with sound, but neither of them was watching. That night, lying awake, Evan replayed her words over and over. "I don't really exist in my own life sometimes." He told himself he was misinterpreting. That she would have told him if something were wrong. Marisol stared at the ceiling, wondering if she should have said more on the phone, wondering if Evan would ever ask. They both lay inches apart, each wrapped in their own assumptions, each believing the other was choosing the silence. The distance between them grew, not from anger, not from neglect, but from everything they believed without ever confirming. And for the first time, the misunderstanding felt too large to ignore. The days that followed felt slightly off, like a picture hanging just crooked enough to be noticed. Evan found himself watching Marisol more closely, though he tried not to make it obvious. He noticed how she moved through the house with a careful efficiency, how she lingered less in shared spaces and more in rooms where the door could be closed halfway. He told himself he was imagining it. Marisol noticed Evan's attention too, the way his eyes followed her, the way his questions hovered just short of meaning. She wondered if he had heard her phone call. If he was waiting for her to say something first. She told herself if he wanted to know he would ask. Neither of them did. One evening Evan came home to find Marisol dressed differently than usual. Nothing dramatic, just more intentional. She wore a blouse he hadn't seen in a while, her hair pulled back neatly. She stood by the door, keys in hand. "Going out?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "Just meeting someone?" "Who?" The question slipped out before he could soften it. Marisol paused. "A friend." The answer was true, but incomplete. Evan felt something twist in his chest. Uncertainty maybe, or the unfamiliar sting of being left out. "Oh," he said. "Okay." She hesitated, as if waiting for something else. When it didn't come, she nodded and left. The door closed quietly behind her. Evan stood in the entryway longer than necessary, listening to the fading sound of her footsteps. He told himself he had no reason to feel unsettled. She hadn't done anything wrong. He trusted her. So why did the silence she left behind feel different? Marisol sat across from her friend at a small cafe, stirring her drink without tasting it. When asked how things were going, she hesitated. "They're fine," she said automatically. Her friend raised an eyebrow. "That's not an answer." Marisol sighed. The words tumbled out more easily than she expected. Not accusations. Not anger. Just an admission of feeling absent. "I don't think he sees me anymore," she said quietly. Or maybe he never really did. Saying it out loud made it feel heavier and clearer. Back at home, Evan paced the living room, restless. He tried to focus on the television, then on his phone, then on nothing at all. Her words from the other night echoed again in his mind. "I don't really exist in my own life sometimes." The thought that he might be part of that feeling made his chest tighten. When Marisol came home later, the house was dark except for a lamp in the corner. Evan sat on the couch, hands clasped. "You're back," he said. "Yes," she replied, setting her bag down. "Late?" "Not really." They stood there, facing each other, both aware of the distance and unsure how to cross it. "How was it?" Evan asked. She considered telling him. Considered saying she'd talked about them. About herself. About the quiet ache that had been growing for years. "It was nice," she said instead. He nodded. The moment passed. That night, sleep came slowly. Evan lay awake, thinking about the way she'd looked when she left, focused, purposeful. He wondered if he'd missed the chance to be part of that. Marisol lay beside him, wondering if this was how things began to end, not with a fight, but with parallel lives slowly drifting apart. In the darkness, both of them reached the same conclusion without ever sharing it. Silence wasn't neutral anymore. It was choosing for them. The break didn't come with an argument. It came on an ordinary afternoon, the kind that usually passed without leaving a mark. Marisol had been cleaning the spare room, determined to finally organize the boxes she'd been avoiding for years. Dust clung to the air, sunlight cutting through the window in thin lines. She moved slowly, deliberately, opening one box at a time. That was when she found it. The box of art supplies sat tucked behind an old suitcase, heavier than she remembered. When she lifted the lid, the smell of dried paint rose up, familiar and sharp. Tubes hardened with age. Brushes cracked and stiff. Sketchbooks stacked neatly, their covers worn. Marisol sank to the floor. She picked up a brush and turned it over in her hands, her chest tightening. Memories flooded back. Late nights lost in color, the freedom of expression, the way painting once made her feel whole. She hadn't meant to stop. She had just gone quiet. The realization hit her harder than she expected. Footsteps sounded in the hallway. Evan had come home early again. He stopped in the doorway, taking in the scene, the open box, the brushes in her hands, the stillness of her posture. Something about it made his chest ache. "You don't paint anymore," he said. The words were simple. Careful. Almost hesitant. Marisol looked up, surprised. For a moment, habit urged her to nod, to brush it off, to say it wasn't important. But the box felt heavy in her lap. And something about the way Evan was standing, uncertain, exposed, felt different. "I didn't think you noticed," she said quietly. "I did," Evan replied. His voice didn't retreat this time. "I just didn't know how to ask." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was fragile. Marisol set the brush down slowly. "I stopped, because it started to feel pointless," she said. The words came unevenly, as if they'd been waiting a long time. Like I was making something no one was really seeing. And then, I got used to not making it. Evan swallowed. The confession landed deeper than he expected. I get used to things too, he said. To holding stuff in. I think I thought that was love. Not burdening you. Marisol looked at him then. Really looked at him. Not the calm exterior. Not the dependable routines. The man underneath, standing uncertainly in the doorway. I never asked you to carry everything alone, she said. I know, he replied. That's the problem. They stood there, neither moving closer, neither stepping away. The space between them felt charged, not with anger, but with years of unsaid truth. I feel lonely, Marisol said finally. The word trembling but clear. Not because you're gone, but because I don't know how to reach you anymore. Evan's chest tightened. I've been afraid, he admitted. Afraid of saying the wrong thing. Afraid of what might come out if I stop controlling it. She nodded slowly. I've been afraid of asking for more. The honesty didn't arrive all at once. It came in pieces, broken, careful, real. They talked about fear, about avoidance, about how silence had once kept them safe, and slowly pulled them apart. There were pauses, long ones. But this time the pauses weren't walls. They were breaths. When they finally stopped talking, neither of them felt fixed, or certain, or suddenly healed. But something had shifted. The quiet felt different now. Less lonely. More honest. They didn't sit down right away. Evan stayed in the doorway for a moment longer, then stepped into the room as if crossing a line he'd avoided for years. Marisol closed the box of art supplies but didn't push it away this time. It stayed between them, present and undeniable. Neither of them rushed to fill the space. The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was careful. I didn't mean to disappear, Marisol said eventually. I just thought, if I needed less, things would stay easier. Evan nodded slowly. I thought if I said less, things would stay calm. They shared a small, almost smile at that. Not relief. Recognition. So we both shrank, she said. Yes, he replied. And I didn't even realize I was asking you to. You weren't, she said gently. I did it on my own. That honesty mattered. It took the sharp edges off blame, leaving only responsibility, shared, imperfect, human. They moved to the kitchen together, instinctively. The table was still there, unchanged. The same table where they'd shared thousands of meals, where the kettle had screamed itself hoarse more than once. Evan poured water into the kettle and set it on the stove. This time, he stayed close. Marisol watched him, noticing the way his shoulders seemed less rigid. Not relaxed, just less guarded. When the kettle began to heat, she spoke again. I don't need everything to change overnight, she said. I just don't want to feel like I'm living next to you instead of with you. Evan leaned against the counter, considering her words carefully. I don't want to hide from you, he said. I just don't always know how to be honest without being afraid of myself. She reached across the counter and took his hand. Not to reassure him, to anchor him. We can learn, she said. Slowly, the kettle clicked off. Neither of them jumped. Evan smiled faintly. That's new. They laughed quietly, the sound surprising them both. Later they sat at the table with their mugs, steam rising between them. The house felt the same, but also different. As if a window had been opened somewhere. Evan spoke first. I might need help sometimes, he said. Naming things. Before they pile up. Marisol nodded. And I might need to say what I want before I convince myself it's not important. They didn't promise perfection. They didn't draft rules or plans. They simply named intentions, letting them rest where they could be reached again. That night, they went to bed without the television on. They lay facing each other, close enough to see the familiar lines of each other's faces. Good night, Evan said. Good night, Marisol replied. The word felt complete. Sleep came easier than it had in months. The days after the conversation didn't feel miraculous. Nothing sparkled. Nothing reset overnight. And somehow, that made the change feel real. Evan and Marisol moved through the house the same way they always had. Morning coffee, shared glances, familiar routines. But something subtle had shifted beneath the surface. The silence was still there. It always would be. But it no longer felt like avoidance. It felt intentional. Evan caught himself pausing more often before retreating into quiet. Not to force words, but to check whether he was hiding or simply resting. Sometimes, he spoke. Sometimes, he didn't. The difference mattered. One evening after a long day, he set his bag down and stayed standing by the door. "I'm overwhelmed," he said. The words felt strange in his mouth, unfinished, imperfect. Marisol looked up from the kitchen counter. She didn't rush to fix it. She didn't minimize it. "Do you want to talk about it?" she asked. "Or do you want company?" Evan considered the question. Really considered it. "Company," he said. She nodded and stepped closer, resting her head briefly against his shoulder. No pressure, no solutions, just presence. Later that week, Marisol carried the box of art supplies back into the spare room. She didn't announce it. She didn't make it symbolic. She simply opened the window, set up the easel, and stood there for a long moment. The first brushstroke felt awkward, uncertain. She kept going anyway. When Evan passed the doorway and saw her there, paint on her fingers, he didn't interrupt. He smiled and kept walking, letting the moment belong to her. That night, she told him about the painting, not in detail, not defensively, just enough. "I forgot how much I missed it," she said. Evan nodded. "I forgot how much I missed seeing you like that." They let the comment sit between them, warm and steady. There were still missteps. Evan still went quiet when stress spiked. Marisol still hesitated before naming what she wanted. But now, when it happened, they noticed. And noticing made all the difference. One afternoon, sitting together on the couch, Marisol spoke without planning to. "I don't want us to disappear into each other," she said. "I want us to stay visible." Evan turned to her. "Me too." The words felt like a promise, not dramatic but durable. They didn't talk more than necessary. They didn't suddenly become people who processed everything out loud. They remained who they were, quiet, thoughtful, careful, but now, the quiet had doors. And when one of them knocked, the other tried to answer. The kettle screamed again one evening a few weeks later. This time, Evan noticed immediately. He reached for it without hesitation, turning off the stove before the sound could fill the room completely. The sudden quiet that followed felt different now. Not heavy, not accusatory. Just still. Marisol looked up from the table, watching him. Their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them. Not a memory of what had been wrong, but an awareness of what they now chose to notice. They sat down across from each other, mugs warming their hands. The same table. The same chairs. The same small kitchen that had held so much silence before. "I was thinking," Marisol said, then paused. Evan waited. "I might submit a piece to the art center next month." He didn't rush to respond. He let the words land fully. "I'd like that," he said. "Not because you should. Just because it matters to you." She smiled, not wide, not dramatic, just real. "And I told my boss I need to stop taking work home every night," Evan added. Not as a promise. Just a boundary. Marisol nodded. "That sounds like you." They drank their tea slowly. There was no sense of arrival. No feeling that they had solved something forever. What they had was quieter than that, and stronger. They had awareness. Some evenings, silence still stretched between them. They still sat on opposite ends of the couch sometimes. They still chose quiet over words more often than not. But now, when the silence grew too long, one of them would ask. Softly, without accusation. "Are we okay? Do you want to say something? Can I tell you something small?" And the other would listen. Not perfectly, not eloquently. But honestly, on a Sunday morning, Marisol painted while Evan read nearby. The house was quiet, sunlight filtering in through open curtains. The silence didn't ask anything of them. It simply existed. Later, they walked the neighborhood again, coffee mugs in hand. A neighbor waved and smiled. "You two always look so peaceful," she said. Evan squeezed Marisol's hand. This time, the words didn't feel ironic. They were still quiet people. They always would be. But now, when silence fell between them, it no longer meant loneliness. It meant space. Space to breathe, to choose, to speak when it mattered. Loneliness hadn't disappeared because they talked more. It disappeared because they stopped hiding. And that, quiet as it was, changed everything. Some love stories don't end with fireworks. They end with understanding. If this story made you pause, reflect, or see your own relationship differently, take a moment and share your thoughts in the comments. What's one thing you've learned about communication, or silence from this story? If you believe stories like this matter, stories that teach real lessons about love, patience, and emotional honesty, please like this video and subscribe to Love Stories by Mr. Johnson. And if someone you care about might need this reminder, share it with them. Sometimes the quietest stories are the ones that stay with us the longest. Thank you for listening.